tend to be a little uneasy with an artist who is so articulate. Has that been a help or a hindrance for you?
So much a hindrance that for a long time I quit writing. You see, a close friend of mine who died prematurely of leukemia, a great American historian of my generation called Richard Hofstadter, and one of his masterpieces is called something like The History of Anti-Intellectualism in America. The Anglo-Saxon tradition, and even the French tradition, is that painters are smart craftsmen, and that there's something arrogant about a painter being literate. Though I've, in my life, never met a first-rate painter who wasn't highly intelligent and extremely articulate in his own terms. It doesn't mean that he writes a Coleridge essay or so on, but is perfectly able to communicate. And actually, painters are the most gregarious of all the artists. Most of the sculptors I know hate each other. Most of the architects. Or I remember one night being at a poet's house, and there were 4 Pulitzer Prize poets there. And I was the only painter. And I was talking to the women after dinner, and the 4 poets were in a passionate discussion, vehement, at the other end of the room. And finally, I rudely, male pig chauvinist, got up and said, "This sounds so interesting, I've got to listen to it," and went over. And what they were, Robert Lowell was one of them. And they had all accepted that Robert Lowell was #1 of all American poets, but they were all arguing who was #2. And really it blows. Now, painters have their own rivalries and jealousies and so on, but actually painters are voyeurs and cafe and coffee house people, and have much more a live and let live attitude. And I think basically you're not trying to convert people that one line is it, or whatever. Or maybe I'm naive. My wife looks at me, my European wife looks at me sometimes and says, "You know why I love you so much?" And I say, "Why?" And she says, "Because you're so innocent."
There are the spirit of several painters who haunt your canvases. And I'm thinking of Picasso and Matisse and Rothko and perhaps even Miro. Would that be accurate to the work of what artists do you most respond?
More than anybody, Piero della Francesca. Secondly, Goya. But and many others. But you see, there's something else that one has to explain. For example, I regard the Van Eycks as, or the one, so far as I know, nobody knows whether 1 or 2, as miraculous painters. And I can only stand there in dumb admiration. But it's impossible for a painter of my cast of mind to do anything with the kind of thing they do, or with Vermeer, or with Velázquez. I've always thought, with absolutely no factual foundation, but I have taught a lot and have known most of the great artists of the century, or at least half of them, that there may be, say, 6 basic kinds of painting minds. And at any given historical moment, the scene needs one kind more than another, and therefore it becomes very prominent. And in that sense, though there are many artists I adore, I have to say that then I belong to, I suppose, to the degree that I can tell, a family of black painters, which would include, and earth-colored painters, which would include Manet and Goya and Matisse, because Matisse is such a great colorist. Nobody understands that his greatest color is black. And other such artists, there's certain works of Picasso that work that way too, and Miro. Certainly, most people, for example, Reinhardt, everybody talks about as a black painter. I don't think he's a black painter at all. I think he's a painter who uses dark tones, which is something very different from thinking of black as black in the sense that one thinks of fire engine red as red, if I make myself clear. And it also has to do with a sense of the surface and so on.
Very carefully articulated attitude toward color, and I assume a strong aversion to some colors too.
Yeah, I can't bear synthetic colors. You know, I like the earth colors and ultramarine blue and the cadmium reds and yellows, and aniline dye colors, or now psychedelic colors, so on, I find as offensive as, I mean, I think they're pretty okay for their own sake, what do you say, I can imagine somebody drinking Fresca or Coca-Cola very easily, but for somebody to presume that this is an equivalent or a substitute for a Latache or a Latour, would you say, for real wine, in the same way that somebody supposes a Kraft slice of cheese in cellophane is what's really meant by cheese. And it's perfectly okay if you're in a hurry and want to stuff something in your pocket or whatever.
1 year of your legendary interest in matters gastronomical, including the fact that you moved close to the best restaurant in your part of the countryside. I wonder... Well,
that's an exaggeration. It is true, I found my place going to the restaurant, but I didn't move there on account of the restaurant. That would be absurd. It'd be cheaper to hire a chef.
However, I wonder if you could tell us what prompted you to accept a commission by, speaking of matters, drinking matters, by Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who several years ago commissioned you to execute a painting above a Mouton Rothschild wine label. What prompted you to do that, and what is the image that you created?
Well, again, there are a lot of elements involved. In the first place, it wasn't exactly a commission. He called me one day, and in effect, as one gentleman to another, implied, I'm very good at what I do, and you're very good at what you do. Would you like to exchange? And temperamentally, I would much rather exchange than sell. Actually, the worst year in years, he misled me that way. It also happened, at that moment, I had just finished, there's an aspect of my work that's not very well known, because I've really never pulled it all together for an exhibition. A lot of them are that I did in the 50s are in England. And I have some huge ones in my studio. One was shown, I think, in my last show or the one before. But they're sort of primordial creatures in a way, or they're very strongly atavistic. One of the deepest impressions of my life, which I won't go into, though they're beautiful stories, is seeing Aldemira and Lascaux and the whole Dordogne country. There's something very deeply atavistic in me. Stonehenge hits me the same way. And after all, I'm half Scottish and half Irish, which is, say, Celtic. And I think in Celts there is something that remains. But who knows?
You think of yourself as the Celt?
Yeah, definitely. You know, after all, I'm full of blarney. But anyway, from time to time, I work with these primordial images, and had just finished largely black, but very definitely cave-like with ochres, and in many ways a passionate picture, if I could be so arrogant as to say so. I think a kind of picture that would look beautiful in the Prado. It has a funny mixture of somberness and passion in it, and I called it Les Caves. Now, cave in French means both cave in the English sense, and also means a cellar, and also means a wine cellar. And I had just finished this, and it was a large painting, and also made very many small paintings going around this kind of thing, when Rothschild got in touch with me, and at that time, I think also I was increasingly annoyed at how art is becoming more and more like couturier business. I mean, instant fashion, instant exploitation, instant everything, and in the midst of this swirling, one searches for rock things, and I like things that in a sense transcend history. One of my favorite books is a 2-volume work by a great French historian called The Mediterranean, which is about the substratum of society, like Sicilians, French peasants, etc., who even now, in 1977, do many things that they were doing in 1977 BC. And cheese, wine, dwellings, fire, forests, the ocean, women, things like that that are substantially there without all this neon punk or funk chic, mean more and more to me. And they're more and more precious to me because I think they're also really eroding. And so, given all of this and many other things, when he proposed it, I had, so to speak, an image called Les Caves. And I had a small version, not of the big picture, but would also happen to be called Les Caves. And I said, if you want to reproduce this small painting on the label, is fine with me, and I'd be greatly honored. And he said, you understand that part of the agreement is that you will get a certain number of cases of wine, and I'll get the painting. And I said, fine, why not? And
that is a French tradition, however. He has a museum of those paintings now.
Yeah, and so it actually says on the underneath the label, unpublished painting, Les Caves, with my name on it, and the image, it's on an ochre ground, and the image is a kind of abstracted, but I think very alive, in the sense that sometimes I have the sensation that it could actually move, a kind of black figure, animal type, that is not so different in feeling for me from the animals at Lascaux and Aldemira. You see, at Aldemira, I was a persona non grata in Spain, and was determined to see Aldemira, which is way in the northwest corner, and was in France, and had a sports car, and figured out how I could drive all the way across Spain, get there, get to Aldemira at lunchtime, just before lunch, see the thing, and get back across the border before all the papers would get through. And unfortunately, got a flat tire and lost an hour. So I arrived at Altamira just as they were closing the gate, the doorway. And so I reached in my pocket and pulled out thousands of pesetos, which must have amounted to $20, and showed it to the guy, and he took one look and went like that and opened the door. And Helen and I went in and walked around, and you don't realize that the cave itself originally was maybe 4 feet high. And what they've done is leave the ground, but then dug down, so you walk around the bottom of the cave at full height, looking up at the ceiling. And there was a single electric light bulb, and I looked at it, and after Lascaux's color and so on, I saw Lascaux before it was damaged. It seemed in many ways, though beautiful, disappointing, like a line drawing. And the guy said in Spanish, "Are you enjoying it?" and so on, but I shrugged a little bit. And I think he saw a slight disappointment in my face. And then he took me by the arm and went to the corner and got a candle and lit it and gave me the lit candle and then pushed me, and I realized I was to get up on this plateau, and I did, holding the candle, and then he turned out the electric light bulb, and then I realized that lying on the floor of the cave, one, I could reach the top of the cave, and the guys obviously at night sat like this and drew their graffiti of animals on the ceiling. But two, what had never occurred to me, and where all the books betray you, is that in the flickering candle, and of course they had torches, the animals moved as the candle flickered. And I've never got over that impression. And in some of the primordial pictures that I paint, though they're just as literally still as the original Altamira things, some of them do have the sense, I don't know, they radiate something, that they could move, some of them in an ominous way.
You regard each single work as an element in a life's work. There are almost 200 in the Open series, more than 140, in spite of the fact you confess to occasionally erring in your numbering in the Elegy series. What happens if there are more in the Cave series? And are there?
Well, I'm sure there will be, but the principal dilemma of somebody who's not interested only in one image is what Kierkegaard calls the despair of the aesthetic. If there are 1,000 beautiful ideas, how do you choose one instead of another? And all I hope, if I ever give up smoking, is to live long enough to develop some of these things much further. And I should also say that the reason I've made so many of whatever I've made that could be called a series, because I detest serial painting, is simply because I feel that I've never really solved any of them. And so they remain a challenge. The day I can make an elegy that really satisfies me, then I'll stop. But it's, if I may cite a mighty name, Cézanne wasn't interested in a mountain. It was that to get Mont Sainte-Victoire exactly as he meant it, he attacked again and again and again till his heart gave out. And it's in that sense that I've attacked an image again and again and again, and not to turn out yard goods, as many of painters do.
One last question, and that is, how did you manage to select one image for the monumental mural that you have been commissioned to do for the new wing, the I.M. Pei designed wing of the National Gallery that will open in, I guess, June of 1978? How did you select an image for that?
Well, actually, I'm made many sketches of many kinds of things, and finally settled on an elegy, but an elegy that is different from any of the others in being, the painting is going to be 31 feet wide, so that it's really quite an enormous painting. And what I'm trying to do is what I think abstract expressionism in part was always trying to do, which is in a way like Zen painting, to make it, huge as it is, make it look as though it were done like that one had a moment of passion and did it. And the technical and energy, etc., problems involved in it are unbelievable. But if I succeed, or to put it the other way around, what else should I do? But try to, given such a location and such a scale, try as best I can and maybe fall flat on my face to make the ultimate statement of what my generation, in my version of my ultimate statement of what my generation.
Moses is talking to God. He says, God, I believe you, I follow you, I trust you, I've never doubted you. But
You reviewed Jackson Pollock's first show at Peggy Guggenheim's. I believe it was for the Partisan Review.
That's right.
What did you say?
Well, again, you have to realize that when I wrote that, most people, including highly cultivated people, didn't think what he was doing was painting at all. And as I remember, I said that I thought he represented one of the few genuine chances of my generation to make a definitive statement, or however I put it.
How would you describe abstract art? And does it have the same meaning for you now, today, as it did when you were fresh to it?
No. The word abstract comes from two Latin words. And what it literally means is to take from or to select from. And in a conversation or in putting on clothes or anything else, telling a story, one has to select. The only way one could do it completely without selecting would really to make a world identical with this world, which I think sometimes certain realist painters really want to do. But I mean, if they want, let's say your subject is the Battle of Gettysburg, if you really want to do it realistically, you have to put every soldier in it, every cloud, every tree, every bullet, every drop of blood, everything. And obviously, even people who sort of want to represent are highly selective in what they do. So that the essential nature of abstraction is to select from, and the point of the selection, this I learned from Alfred North Whitehead, is emphasis. And in that sense, there is no communication in the world, and particularly no work of art, that's not essentially abstract by definition for the purposes of emphasis. But there is a lot of work now that is abstract to the degree that it's difficult to know what is being emphasized. Not only that, there's a lot of contemporary abstract work whose basic premise is all things are equal. nothing is emphasized, and I find it a kind of madness to regard all values as equal. I mean, it's impossible for an intelligent human being to regard a Coca-Cola and an assassination as of equal value. I mean, it's essentially, because to put it in negative terms, it's really to assert that everything is equally valueless. And that, with my whole being, I do not believe.
You've said, and I'd like to quote a rather lengthy thing that you've said, "I feel pain for young artists today. The territory of the modern language has been conquered. There is no longer much unmapped territory. The ground has pretty much been covered." And then you've said, "As modern painting completes its task, younger artists are reduced by arriving so late historically to adding paragraphs or footnotes of great refinement rather than whole chapters to the body of American art." What's a young painter to do? Give up paint and brush?
Let me amplify a little bit what you said, because it sounds very arrogant, or as though I'm an old man.
Maybe I read it improperly.
No. It's the way I said it, but I have a horror of boring people and often say too briefly what I meant. The other day I was asked by a French publisher to write a preface to a book whose title is 1863, The Birth of Modern Art. And there's really quite a brilliant argument about the actual nature of painting. And for convenience's sake, the author believes, for a variety of historical reasons, that 1863, if one could choose a specific date.
He chooses that because of the Salon?
And for many other reasons, yeah. But there's no doubt that modern art is different from any previous art. All previous arts were tribal. Let's say around, for the hell of it, that the French author is correct, that modern art began in 1863. Well, obviously it would be, say, like New Yorkers in 1663, knowing there's a whole continent. And New Yorkers who have decided that they don't want this new continent developed in the old way. Then obviously the first generation has a vast territory. I mean, in fact, a whole continent to explore. And they will settle part of it. The next generation some will go further, some will reinforce what's already been settled, and so on, generation after generation. So that when I say it's a matter of historical circumstance, I mean it in the most literal sense. I would say that modern art, among other things, was an effort to create a language that was more appropriate to the feelings of modern men than the historical, mythological, religious traditions that had dominated art before. Now, obviously, the first generation on the scene has the biggest territory to conquer. The next generation still lots. The next generation still lots. But there does come a moment where one reaches the Pacific, where it all begins to be pretty thoroughly inhabited, and then as each generation is later in time, there are less whole territories to stake out and more refinements or embellishments of specific things that have been discovered but maybe not very thoroughly developed. And it's in that sense that I made this statement. And then to answer your question, one can't invent a whole new continent. I mean, it so happened in 1963, so to speak, there was a whole continent of modern visual language to discover. In my opinion, it now largely is discovered, and in my opinion, the younger artists are, the more they're having to deal with an established language rather than invent a new one. In fact, I think the day of the avant-garde is over. in the sense that what the avant-garde was people making this new vocabulary and new dictionary. It now exists. So there are two possibilities for young people. One is to add footnotes or further refine an aspect of the dictionary, or the other is in Elizabethan times or in medieval times with Dante, for somebody of extraordinary energy, breadth of vision, and so on, come and take this as existing language and make a Shakespearean or a Mozartian or a Dante-esque statement, shooting the whole works, which I think was very much in the back of Picasso's mind, for example, though I don't think he was really successful at it. I think Joyce was so successful that...
This is James Joyce.
Yeah, that no novel since him is really worth reading in terms of this problem. They're interesting in other points of view, but in the sense that poets also were involved in making a modern language, I think, I would say point blank that next to Shakespeare, I think Joyce is the greatest writer in the English language. So that the modernist movement did produce, in words, a supreme masterpiece. In my opinion, to this moment, the closest to a supreme masterpiece is the late work of Cézanne.
You've not only been interested in calligraphy for all of your life, but obviously the word as well. And the work of many poets have either inspired or influenced some of your works.
That's true, but you see, again, we have to talk in historical terms. You kind of, let's say, as in my case, when I first saw my Matisses at Michael Stein's house in Palo Alto, California, when I was 17 in 1932, and realized not only these were marvelous pictures, but that they were not merely an individual genius, that they were part of a whole culture. And then trying to find out, realize that this culture was called modernism. Trying to find out, not being a linguist, what the hell that really meant. And for 10 years, I worked at it, and what I discovered was, if one can think in analogies, and after all of us know words, and those of us who are painters also know paintings, and can very easily, with any imagination, make very accurate analogies. What I discovered was the poets, who after all were the word people, were able to formulate what was meant by modernism much better than up to that moment, at least as what was available in English, the painters were able to. Actually, the first manifesto about modernism is by an American, Edgar Allan Poe. And the second real manifestos are by a French poet who fell in love with Poe, namely Baudelaire. See, Poe had the fantastic luck to have his poetry, his prose translated by Baudelaire, who was certainly one of the great poets of the 19th century, and to have his poetry translated by Mallarmé, who was certainly one of the great poets of the 19th century, so that in French he seems even greater than he does in English. But all the same, I think it's most fitting that it was an American who first asserted literature has to be modern. Now, what he specifically meant by that is a whole other lecture. Poetry has to be brief, etc., not mythological, etc., and so on. In the same way that Baudelaire's great essay on Constantine Guy, which he calls the painter of modern life, is a tremendous emphasis. Get rid of gods and popes and authoritarian pictures and paint what you see around you.
Early on, you became, an advocate and a theorist, a spokesman, and historian Do we tend to be a little uneasy with an artist who is so articulate? Has
Yeah.
that been a help or a hindrance for you?
So much a hindrance that for a long time I quit writing. You see, a close friend of mine who died prematurely of leukemia, a great American historian of my generation called Richard Hofstadter, and one of his masterpieces is called something like The History of Anti-Intellectualism in America. The Anglo-Saxon tradition, and even the French tradition, is that painters are smart craftsmen, and that there's something arrogant about a painter being literate. Though I've, in my life, never met a first-rate painter who wasn't highly intelligent and extremely articulate in his own terms. It doesn't mean that he writes a Coleridge essay or so on, but is perfectly able to communicate. And actually, painters are the most gregarious of all the artists. Most of the sculptors I know hate each other. Most of the architects. Or I remember one night being at a poet's house, and there were 4 Pulitzer Prize poets there. And I was the only painter. And I was talking to the women after dinner, and the 4 poets were in a passionate discussion, vehement, at the other end of the room. And finally, I rudely, male chauvinist, got up and said, "This sounds so interesting, I've got to listen to it," and went over. And what they were, Robert Lowell was one of them. And they had all accepted that Robert Lowell was number 1.
Were they arguing about number 2?
But they were all arguing who was number 2. And really, both. Now, painters have their own rivalries and jealousies and so on. But actually, painters are voyeurs and cafe and coffee house people, and have much more a live and let live attitude. And I think basically you're not trying to convert people that one line is it, or whatever. Or maybe I'm naive. My wife looks at me, my European wife looks at me sometimes and says, "You know why I love you so much?" And I say, "Why?" And she says, "Because you're so innocent."
There are the spirit of several painters who haunt your canvases. And I'm thinking of Picasso and Matisse and Rothko and perhaps even Miro. Would that be accurate? To the work of what artists do you most respond?
More than anybody, Piero della Francesca. Secondly, Goya. But and many others. But you see, there's something else that one has to explain. For example, I regard the Van Eycks or the one. So far as I know, nobody knows whether 1 or 2, as miraculous painters. And I can only stand there in dumb admiration. But it's impossible for a painter of my cast of mind to do anything with the kind of thing they do, or with Vermeer, or with Velázquez. I've always thought, with absolutely no factual foundation, but I have taught a lot and have known most of the great artists of the century, or at least half of them, that there may be, say, 6 basic kinds of painting minds. And at any given historical moment, the scene needs one kind more than another, and therefore it becomes very prominent. And in that sense, though there are many artists I adore, I have to say that then I belong to, I suppose, to the degree that I can tell, a family of black painters, which would and earth-colored painters, which would include Manet and Goya and Matisse, because Matisse is such a great colorist. Nobody understands that his greatest color is black. And other such artists, there's certain works of Picasso that work that way too, and Miro. Certainly, most people, for example, Reinhardt, everybody talks about as a black painter. I don't think he's a black painter at all. I think he's a painter who uses dark tones, which is something very different from thinking of black as black in the sense that one thinks of fire engine red as red, if I make myself clear. And it also has to do with a sense of the
Well, you
surface.
have a very
and so on.
carefully articulated attitude toward color, and I assume a strong aversion to some colors too.
Yeah, I can't bear synthetic colors. You know, I like the earth colors and ultramarine blue and the cadmium reds and yellows, and aniline dye colors or now psychedelic colors or so on, I find as offensive as, I mean, I think they're pretty okay for their own sake, well, you see, I can imagine somebody drinking Fresca or Coca-Cola very easily, but for somebody to presume that this is an equivalent or a substitute for a Latache or a Latour, would you say, for real wine, in the same way that somebody supposes a Kraft slice of cheese and cellophane is what's really meant by cheese. And it's perfectly okay if you're in a hurry and want to stuff something in your pocket or whatever.
One hears of your legendary interest in matters gastronomical, including the fact that you moved close to the best.
The repeat.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Yale University Art Gallery. I'm Stephanie Wiles, the Henry J. Heinz II director. We all know, we all know that spring has truly arrived in New Haven when John Walsh is back and we're about to set off on a new adventure together. Today, John kicks off a four-part series on Henri Matisse, based as always in close looking and a deep study of artistic breakthroughs. John's contributions to our appreciation and understanding of artists like Van Gogh, Picasso, and Mondrian are unrivaled. In person and online, his lectures have reached hundreds of thousands of people. For those of you who are new to the audience or new on listening online, John Walsh graduated from Yale College in 1961 and earned his PhD from Columbia University. His curatorial expertise was honed at the Frick Collection, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and in Boston as curator of paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts. During his remarkable tenure as director of the Getty Museum, John built up the collections, he built up the staff, He oversaw the creation of a new and magnificent museum and campus and began the planning of the Getty Villa. John is a legendary teacher. Each fall, he returns to Yale to work with our education department and the Wordle Gallery teachers who lead our K-12 tours. John's commitment to nurturing aspiring teachers and scholars greatly benefits all of us here in the New Haven community and at Yale, and we are just so grateful to him for what he does for us. Today's lecture is generously sponsored by the Martin A. Ryerson Lectures Fund. Thank you all for being here today in the spring rain that we're having now, and for those of you online. And John, over to you.
I want to welcome you all, and I mean by all, I'm not just talking about you here in the room, whom I love, but also, I'm told, 4 times the number of people who are seeing this on live stream. This is a real testament to the gallery, I think, and to this very exciting program of public events that the gallery sponsors so generously. Now, Matisse. This is an artist whom everybody has heard of, and for some of you, this is actually an introduction to Matisse. For others, though, it's a reintroduction. I'm hoping it can be useful to all of you. Matisse, you realize, shares credit with Picasso and Mondrian, and you could, in a stretch, say Kandinsky and Duchamp for pioneering modern art. In these 4 lectures, I'm going to take you through the phases of Matisse's career, each time looking closely at a painting that's not far from here, in some cases upstairs, but in any case, in a day's trip, so that you'll want to go and see for yourself. He had a career that was 60 years long and was enormously productive. His work is full of delights and discoveries and astonishments and puzzles. It's been studied by generations of writers, so that there's a huge and excellent literature on Matisse. I've depended on it desperately for ideas and judgments. I put the most important titles of this literature, whether they're new books or easily gotten through the online used books services. And I've also put on the website some links to major museum collections of Matisse and some videos. And so you should feel free to use those. But let's now plunge right in. Our entry into Matisse is this painting in the gallery upstairs, painted in 1906 when he was 36. I want us to just have a leisurely stroll through it, a look at it in some detail, and then I'll come back and talk to you. I think we can take it in fairly quickly. There's a tabletop with an orange, lemon or lemons, a melon in the middle, some small green things, which my wife Jill says are peppers, and 2 ceramic bowls. There's a white plaster statue of a young woman, and behind that, flowers, some pink and red blossoms and green leaves. In the center, near the top, there's a little cluster of white stabs with the brush that might be a flower, abbreviated, cut loose from the bouquet. All of this in an interior space that's just suggested, not spelled out. The right-hand quarter of the picture could suggest a translucent blue curtain, and it partly revealing a sort of hot red vertical patch of something beyond. Down on the table, if we try to trace the edges, we can do that pretty well until they disappear behind the statue and the melon, where we encounter a kind of purple cloud. We'd expect a vase there to hold the flowers, but instead there's this floating purple zone that's just the beginning of the floating patches of color that occupy the top third of the picture and can't easily be recognized. They function like the blossoms. The patches play around behind the white plaster statue. They sort of caress the edges and peep out from between her arm and her side. So some things in the picture we can identify, and some things not. They are abstracted forms, and they add color and variety and life to the image. Now, as to the flowers and the missing vase, I think the painting on the right was based on the same setup, but it's focused on the bouquet. In the Yale painting, the bouquet is upstaged by the fruit and the statue. And Matisse has given it a muted, slightly grayer tonality. Now, there's a reason for all this, I think. In order to paint the Yale still life, Matisse used his flower piece as part of the setup. Our master digital manipulator here at the Yale Gallery, John French, has helped me to be sure of that by visualizing what Matisse would have seen. His finished flower piece, at the right, propped up behind the table. That was the basis for the Yale painting at the left. A little game of appearances, and as you'll see, not the first kind of deception in Matisse's work. There are a few other things here in the still life we can recognize in other paintings of the same period and earlier. Here's a tablecloth in the middle with a black center serving as a hanging on the wall. It's much bigger, and there's also that melon in the middle. At the right, the red and black cloth, again, back on the table with the same cup and spoon. He paints it from above, tilting it at you, so at a steep angle, and floating in no place we can recognize. The statue is a piece of his own that he'd been working on recently in plaster. It hasn't yet been cast in bronze. We're going to see that Matisse put great energy in studying nude models in drawings and in clay and plaster for most of his career. He's going to subject them to all kinds of exaggerations and abbreviations. Here they're very gentle ones, based on his work in clay. He puts her at the edge, but he pulls her into the composition with diagonals that rhyme with the stems and leaves. Her long, narrow shape balances also the vertical shapes on the far right. I mean, Matisse thought through all of this and adjusted it with great care. By including a plaster cast in his still life paintings, Matisse was following tradition. I mean, this is a Cézanne, a table with fruit and a statuette by a 17th century sculptor. And as for flowers, Matisse was joining a long lineage in French art. Flower pieces were a challenge to composition and color, as well as being a pretty reliable source of income. Artists were urged to study pictures in the Louvre, where there were lots of great examples like these from the 17th and 18th century. The great bouquet by the Dutch painter Jan van Huysum on the left, a carefully painted melee of flowers in a state of decline, or in the middle, the bright bouquets of Anne Volley-Coster in the middle, or at the right, much more vigorous brushwork that Delacroix applied to the blossoms. Painters of the generation before Matisse, like Monet and Renoir, became much more adventuresome in their compositions. In the middle, Odillon Redon made intensely colored arrangements and painted them mainly in pastel. Matisse had bought one of these Redon flower pieces 6 years earlier. These are all by Matisse, amazingly, at the same time as our still life. He was using flower pieces as a kind of testing ground, not just for color, but for painting techniques. At the far left, a pointillist application of painting. In the center, a kind of suggestive fluidity. And in the bouquet at the right, you saw a moment ago, forcefully saturated colors. There were some quirky still lifes, too. The most surprising, for me, being the one on the right, trying out a kind of faux naive simplicity with a folk-like ceramics and downstage a quartet of sprouting onions. In the summer of 1906, the year of all these experiments with still life, Matisse was established already in the eyes of traditionalists as a radical, as a danger to art. They saw him as the newest leader in the progressive destruction of traditional values, of discipline and faithfulness to nature, a successor to Cézanne and Gauguin and Seurat. Seed merchant, hardworking, with a demanding personality. Matisse said about his mother, "She loved everything I did." She encouraged his painting as a child, and he drew in sketchbooks, he took violin lessons, he designed and operated a toy theater. And much later, he remembered traveling fairs and how he wanted to perform like the actors and the musicians that he'd seen. After all, he said, an artist is an exhibitionist. He wasn't much of a student. At 12, he was sent away to school, but left in 1887, suffering from colitis. At 17, he proposed to his parents that he should study law in the Sorbonne. He did, and he said that the law was Hebrew to me. Still, he came back and served a term as a law clerk, not successfully. It was boring in Beaune. It was commercial and unbeautiful, and the weather was terrible. The cheerful picture with the tour bus here at the right shows the family shop nowadays, and the house serving these nowadays as a shrine to Matisse. Matisse was happy to get away. Luxury fabrics that supplied the couture houses in Paris. His excellent biographer, Hilary Sperling, is convinced that Matisse is growing up with this abundance of textiles all around him, helped to give him the taste for them we see in his paintings too, later on. There wasn't much else for his visual imagination in his hometown. Sperling makes it clear that late adolescence for Matisse, he was a victim. I held a box of colors in my hand. I knew this was my life. Like an animal that plunges headwards towards what it loves, I dived in to the understandable despair of my father. It was a tremendous bound in which I was completely free. He had an introduction to William Bouguereau, who was the leading academic artist of the time.